Our keynote speaker tonight is Stefanos Polyzoides, who was born and educated in Athens, Greece, earned a bachelor's and master's in architecture from Princeton University in architecture and planning. His career has engaged a broad span of architecture and urbanism, its history, theory, design, and education. He's a co-founder of the Congress for New Urbanism, and his wife is Elizabeth Moule, a partner in Moule and Polyzoides, and is Pasadena, California practice since 1990. And from 1973 to 1997, he was an associate professor of architecture at the University of Southern California. He is a co-author of monographs on Myron Hunt, Caltech, Wallace Neff, Johnson, Kaufman and Coates, Los Angeles Courtyard Housing, which all you architects probably have in your library, and the Plazas of New Mexico in 2012, Temple of Science, the 100-inch telescope at Mount Wilson Observatory in 2018, and he's the author of R.M. Schindler Architect, and a forthcoming, I'm going to obliterate this, but Stefanos from Experiment to Model of Resilient Urbanism and Courtyard Housing Today, 30 projects by Moule Polyzoides. So he's currently the Dean of School of Architecture at University of Notre Dame. So he really has the full range from USC to Notre Dame, and he probably has to fight against himself sometimes for for who's going to win the football game. So with that, Stefanos, it's an absolute privilege to have you with us, and I'm sure we're going to have a wonderful presentation from you. And thank you for joining us. And also, just as another note, as a side note, we actually tried to get Stefanos to be in the original symposium from 2 years ago when we did the original symposium as a 2 or 3 day event, and he couldn't join us because he was a part of Spain's official award program for architects, and so he had to fly to Spain. So we had to let you go for that. But now, now you're captured in in South Bend with Zoom, so we can have you now join us for this one. So we're very happy to have you here. So
thank you, Anthony. Let me share my screen, please.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you all for your invitation, for being here tonight. I have to say, I'm very honored on the one hand, and deeply touched that you have decided to tie into this discussion. On the other hand, I'm very frustrated over the fact that it has to be done by Zoom, and for two reasons. First of all, because like probably you, I'm zoomed out, and secondly, because I was in Santa Barbara only on Monday, spending Easter there with my family, and had to leave, and because of course we could be together for this presentation. But nonetheless, I think the subject is very important, and I'm very happy to be able to share it with you. My presentation is in 3 parts. There's a little bit of history. I was planning not to give any history, but when I saw the trees being cut down in the median in Summerland, I realized we're not out of the age of sprawl, of the dark days of barbarism and in architecture and urbanism. And the second part is going to be about our work and what has been accomplished really in the world of the new urbanism over the last 30 years. And the last piece is going to be a little essay on Santa Barbara. So this image is 1 year older than I am. So basically our environmental issues, challenges, opportunities, and disasters in the United States are as old as the oldest people in this room today. This is an important vision, which was very rudely upset by a number of developments in our society that had to do mostly with cheap money, fast construction, emphasis on moving, abandonment of cities, bias of all kinds, and the making of cities that are not meant for human habitation. At the same time, we've been assaulted by architects who, for reasons totally ideological, have to do with their own peculiar ideas and ideals, believe that buildings that were isolated and disconnected from each other and did not make fabric, but existed loose in space and without any connection or relationship to both the physical past or the ideological past, were better and more important than anything that existed in the present. This is Pruitt-Ago in St. Louis, before it was bombed into non-existence, into oblivion. And these are projects by some of the great gurus of modern and contemporary architecture, which are basically the same ideals simply presented in a slightly more elaborate and artful form. What we're left with, I think, are the derivatives of all this of this process, and our cities, which are mostly made by housing, are given now to us in this lowest common denominator form, which is, you know, the 4 or 5 story wood frame over parking, the same everywhere, you know, continuous walls, windows defining bedrooms, bathrooms, or living rooms, total repetition horizontally and vertically, the same everywhere, from Maine to San Diego and from Florida to Seattle, the same buildings everywhere, a complete destruction of the notion of special character and special place. On top of that, we have this kind of problem. For the architects, you know what that means. And this has given us a very uncomfortable state of affairs to deal with. There are a couple of very disturbing residual aspects beyond the you know, economic formulas that have given us this very abominable way of housing people. And that is really single use zoning, and the way Crayola zoning, as we call it, zoning that has to do with a non-definition, avoidance of the notion of physical space. And then the issue of FAR, the making of buildings in cities which are generated by some kind of multiple of the area of a given lot. It is a very unarchitectural and very disturbing and destructive way of making cities, because these two buildings are of the same FAR, 0.66. It so happens that one has a much bigger side, and the other one has a much smaller one. So because FAR is given proportionately to sites by the actual acreage, what comes out of them is completely disconnected from any sense of physical reality, continuity, or relationship between pieces that are adjacent to each other. Enter the new urbanism, and we've gone through a reform movement of the last 30 years, has delivered some very powerful and terribly important and useful tools. The Transact is an important tool because it claims that there are qualities of place that exist and can be emulated. In other words, that what is in place as character and needs to be identified, and needs to be the DNA according to which a place needs to grow. And it can grow by being de-densified, by continuing at the same level of complexity, or by you know, proceeding into a different kind or state of city. But in all cases, there are limits in the way in which buildings, open space, landscape, and infrastructure come together to give different kinds of environment, from metropolitan centers to city centers, to city neighborhoods, to town neighborhoods, to village neighborhoods, to rural neighborhoods, to scattered buildings in nature, and essentially nature and conservation. So, and of course, there are many more and more refined versions of these kinds of zones and levels of intensity, but by and large, it's a reminder that you don't throw you know, high-rise buildings in the countryside, as you see in rural France, Germany, and Italy, and other kinds of European countries these days, or in Japan, in China and other Asian places. The fact is that there has to be some kind of relationship between the way in which buildings, nature, and everything that happens in both of these places actually come together in some form that is more positive. We are heirs in this country to a most extraordinary millennial urbanism, begins in ancient Greece, and this urbanism ties right of ways to blocks to lots and buildings, and buildings by type to these lots in such a way so that we're capable to make an urban fabric that is related to the repetition of these types. This is a really wonderful, simple diagram of the common American city circa 1950. Maybe I should say, yeah, circa 1950. That's more like it, where you can see the densities of 2 to 8 dwellings per acre on the edges, then 10 to 20, then 20 to 50, and then 50 to 100 in the center. This is one of maybe eight parts in a typical American city of 50 to 100 years ago. And it is this kind of city we've violated through the issues and the means that I alluded to in the beginning of my presentation. We know that the important tools that I have at our disposal, and which we are rediscovering, is how to subdivide space that's given to us in the terms of traditional urbanism. So we can take a piece of land, we can introduce streets and alleys, we can plant it, we can lot it, and we can introduce types in such a way so that in this very, very simple way that you can see in a recent project of ours, you can introduce a grid into a city, streetscape it, give it public space and infrastructural ecological consideration in design, and then introduce types and make a wonderful fabric of a kind that used to be given to us automatically and has completely escaped us in the last few generations. What is most astounding for all of you who I'm sure have traveled is widely, is that in the whole world, under the current means of conceiving buildings and cities, every city in the world is beginning to look like every other. The city of freestanding buildings destroys any sense of uniqueness in culture and place. And we know actually that the very simple millennial method of street block and building I've just outlined has given us every single city in the world being different than every other. So on the basis of this very simple idea, you can see what Rome looks like, what Quito looks like, what Fifth Avenue in Manhattan look like, what Pasadena looks like. These are the same ideas or the same ideals of town and city making, the same system of understanding circulation, I mean mobility, I should say better than circulation, mobility of all modes, the nature of public space, the nature of buildings. So it is a miraculous state of affairs that we have suddenly discovered 30 years ago, that we can actually return to this, that the way in which modern urbanism came to us in the 1920s and the devastating effects that it's had is an aberration. And that we can actually return to a way of making projects and thinking about the future in a way that's more like the kinds of places we love than the ones we've lost in the last period of time. Examples. First, public space. This is a 6-lane, extraordinarily ugly suburban main street in Lancaster, California. It is being reduced from 6 lanes to 4. One lane parking, one movement on either side of the street. A Rambla in the middle with diagonal parking on weekends and evenings. Various ways of planning it to accommodate a busy afternoon or evening over a weekend, a day farmers market or a parade on the 4th of July. And then a simple way of understanding how this could be refined and reconstructed, transformed into a real place for the middle of a town that had no place. And so after about half a dozen moves, you can get from the plan of the farmers market to an image of it, and eventually to the reality of it. This is a photograph of a 9-month reconstruction of this place, and this is it about 3 years ago, and the first time in the history of this town where they had a Christmas celebration was when this Rambla was finished. And it is important for you to keep in mind, not only that public space is really an important part of our daily lives and of our culture, of our way of being with each other, of the way of organizing, the way of expressing ourselves as citizens, politically, socially, in every way. But if we don't have it, then we don't have a public life. And this is exactly what is happening in American suburbs and has been happening for the longest period of time. So these are these people celebrating in many ways the fact that they're now part of the American mainstream. Another way of dealing with projects of public space is resisting freeways. Let me put it this way: resisting useless freeways, like this leftover piece of a now abandoned freeway, 6 mile right-of-way freeway between Pasadena and Alhambra, that the citizens of Pasadena fought for about 60 years. Our firm was involved with a community group in finally coming to grips with the idea of this was not about stopping this place, but about reconstructing the city. So after a brief charrette and 2 years of fighting, we convinced the state to erase this project and to give back to the city. This was the simple intensity diagram of development by the citizens. Red, ochre, and yellow, obviously 3 levels of intensity. There's a wonderful boulevard that is organizing the access from the city to the freeway now that the freeway does not come into the city. This is the nature of this majestic boulevard with the mountains in the background. It is as big and important as some of the great avenues in the country. The Commonwealth Avenue, for instance, in Boston, approximate this dimension, a grand place. And we've come along as urbanists and architects in understanding the nature of a traditional city, that we can then draw a project that replaces the freeway without actually having designed the buildings in their entirety. And it's not that the buildings are not reasonable. They're reasonable because we've built them. We built every one of them individually so that we can predict them. And in predicting them, we can actually convey to citizens and politicians the way in which this kind of places can be transformed for the benefit of human beings, opposed to the benefit of moving cars. The thing that changed the story here was that 1 acre of land, I'm not exactly sure what 1 acre of land is worth in downtown Santa Barbara, but 1 acre of land in downtown Pasadena is worth $10 million. These are 67 net acres of land for a price of approximately $670 million. When it became very clear what the net gain to the city might be through the development of this process, minus infrastructure, construction, et cetera, probably a $500 million gain, that changed everything. Then the city became the first advocate for this project, and in the last year, this area has been returned, is being returned to the city, and we're in the last moments of that transaction. We've also been very active, not only in our firm, but as in urbanists in general, in reconstructing and reclaiming neighborhoods and districts. This is a very, very beautiful project of ours in San Antonio. You can see the extension of the River North, the blue line in the middle. The River North is in the downtown area to the left. This project took the River North from the center and extended it all the way beyond the freeway ring of the city, almost 2 miles. It's one of the greatest projects of public works in the United States, well worth a visit. You can actually go by boat up and down this project. It has a relatively strong code. It's Texas, so there is no such thing as strong codes. But the idea was to give the citizens a handle about the difference between making buildings on certain streets of a certain intensity, as you can see, very highly connected to the architecture of that place, and then streets parallel to the main artery Broadway in a lesser density, smaller buildings, houses and versions of multiple houses in single house form in a place where transit could be placed as well. What was miraculously beautiful about this project, this also being Texas, which is an audacious place, is that we suggested in the course of this project that the 3 great institutions that were on this river and were opening to the other side with their backs to the river ought to actually open up on the river as well. So the museum opened up already based on our plan. This is our sketch from the charrette about opening up an entrance to the museum from the river. And this is the Philharmonic Hall, which has been renovated with a new opening to the river. This was our sketch in the charrette of how one would get to the river. And this actually, by understanding typology in granular building terms, one can then take a whole extension to a city like this and introduce types in such a way that one can understand capacity, one understand street quality, one can understand infrastructure, transit, and final form, in a way then that can sustain the writing of codes that can deliver such a vision to the degree possible. In brown are the buildings to be infilled, in white the buildings to be that are in place, and this project is well on its way 10 years later. I want to show you a project that is actually going on right now in Claremont. It is not over by a long shot, but this was the master plan for this project. There are now 4 architects working on these buildings, but you can see that this is a highly constrained project in terms that we're very familiar to Santa Barbarans, because the locals don't want crew-cut buildings at one density. So the master plan suggests that buildings step back from Indian Hill Boulevard, and even buildings that are very uncomfortable, like Texas Wraps, have courtyards around them and so on, and make the nature of the streets and the impression of fabric on the streets very, very familiar and very, very connected to a scale of city that is person driven. What is unusual about this is that we now know how to make buildings from the outside in. Not only do we know how to make them as models at the scale you saw them in San Antonio typologically, but we can make them as architecture because we've designed so many of these buildings that we actually know what they're like from the inside out, so we can predict them from the outside in, maybe to a certainty of probably 90%. This is the aerial rendering of this 12 acres of extension of the southwest extension to Claremont Village, and you can see there's a new train coming to stop there, one of Los Angeles' new transit lines. And this is the building that is stepping back on Indian Hill from 2 to 3 to 4, and with tower-like elements on the singular cross street in the middle of the entrance of the project. 12 acres is a significant size for being able to make a place like this. It's about 12 acres is almost 6 Santa Barbara blocks. And so there is a hotel on the right-hand side based with a building on top of it. The Vortex, a historic building, warehouse that's opening up as a market hall. And to the left is a small commercial office building. And then a new plaza. Again, you can imagine these buildings are designed from the outside in, but without any understanding of the inside out, other than the intuition of knowing how these buildings are built as dimensions, both horizontally and vertically, and how units are demarcated and so on. So what is very important about this, which is an entire Santa Barbara lesson, as I will tell you in a second, is that this 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 story configuration is so put together as to deny the thought that this is really a monolith of the kind that citizens detest. And you can see new buildings, old buildings, buildings of various sizes, wonderfully set back, making a small public space of a kind that does not exist currently in Claremont, which could be the new center of this college town. Similarly, fragments of buildings on a block, making blocks in the pure Santa Barbara way with small, middle, and big pieces, and a view of the terminus of Green Street, which is the street in the middle laterally come from Indian Hill into the side, and then a view back from the Vortex, from the recycled market building back into this street that can be pedestrian and/or vehicular, bollarded at times for markets and so on. And finally, housing in the 2, 3, and 4 story territory, broken up sufficiently at a scale that you know very well in Santa Barbara, with your most recent buildings facing onto a park and feeling just totally comfortable in this kind of environment of 2-story and 3-story buildings around it. And there is no miracle more intense really in the last 20 years than what has been accomplished by traditionalist architects in infilling of buildings. In 1977, as a very, very young faculty member, I was 11 at the time, not really, but very young. I was 26, I think, my first year of teaching at USC. I discovered, along with a couple of colleagues, this typology called Courtyard Housing, or COURT, in Los Angeles. We traced about 2,000 buildings. In 1977, as I said, we just wrote a book on this type, and then it took us 12 years to persuade anybody to give us a commission to build one of those. But we made some very wonderful studies, and we began to understand this much more deeply than just by simply observing, because we thought a lot about what this typology meant. And it begins, as you can see, from the bungalow court to an attached court, which is basically a side-by-side unit structure, attached and stacked, which speaks for itself. Hybrid court with some of the units are walk-ups and some are driven by an elevator, and double-loaded hybrid where the elevator piece is fatter and taller. And we can go from 12 to 60 dwellings per acre. At this time in 1977, people didn't know what densities meant. The density and typology had not been connected. So this missing middle housing definition began to really give architects power and planners power in understanding how words and numbers connected to physical forms of a kind that could predict the form of the city. In 20 years ago, approximately, somebody gave us a commission to do this magnificent court in West Hollywood, 7 fountains. It was built for $170 square foot and sold 10 years later for $1,200 square foot. It is made of wood and stucco. It's a very simple building. It is charming. It is welcome for people. It's diverse in units. It's beautiful gardens. And it really talks to people about how they want to live. And there is no housing in Los Angeles, very little of it, maybe less than 10% of the housing in the city of Los Angeles that is not single family houses, talks to people about how they want to live. The market is completely driven. It's a zombie market driven by financial arrangements that are abstract, and no one cares about how people live. And by extension, they don't care about their money, because they're putting money, they're getting minor returns instead of putting money to get substantial returns that have to do with pushing the market envelope. This building taught us a number of things. It taught us that we could put parking underneath one side of the building, so we would have, in a very narrow lot, 120 feet wide, we would have very verdant gardens and Andalusian gardens with hard grounds and potted plants. It taught us that at 30 and 40 use per acre, we could reduce the buildings to house forms and assemble house forms in a way that the place looked absolutely natural. And it also taught us that we could go as far as to match the intensities and the forms of buildings around us, but also provide open space and parking in places in the front, for instance, for short-term parking that were completely unacceptable by code, and where by the nature of our building, we began to convince reasonable planning officials that there was a way to do housing which did not take away from the city, but give back to the city in a way that was unprecedented and extraordinary and needed to be taken into account. This developer, by the way, excuse me, I have to go back a couple of images. This developer built about only 2/3 of the density that was available to him here, because this was a place where he'd grown up on these two house lots, and he made twice as much as the people next door that had used the entire intensity. That speaks for the subject of quality as opposed to volume. This is the front elevation, activates the street, parking on the lower side, beautiful internal courtyards, the units, all of them directly or indirectly accessible from the street, the building facing the street actively. This is the main entrance. All the circulation is outdoor. There is no elevator in this building. It's all accessible by horizontal corridor and stairs. The entrance overlooks the entrance to the garage on the left, straight entrance through. This is the long view of the courtyard. There is a very high degree of massing variations from 2 to 3 to 4 to a tower of 5. There's a 5-story tower in the middle of this building that has no elevator. You have to go 2 stories within a unit to get there. But the view is so exhilarating that it's fetching prices so extraordinary that nobody could ever imagine. And this is the reverse view of that shot. There's a fireplace, a discovery that we made when we looked at Courtyard Housing in Los Angeles during our academic book adventure, and we repeated it here. This is a wonderful project where every unit has 2 entrances, one for the people who live there and one for work-live, where people can come and visit the person working out of this unit. So there are many extraordinary things. 20 years ago, And this was the beginning of a career for us in Courtyard Housing that has had us build more than 30 of them, design more than 30, build at least half of them in Los Angeles over the last period of time. And you can see here what happens when a building like this from a Google Earth aerial begins to be properly inserted in the city. Instead of this deadening walls that are parallel, the courtyards actually open up either directly into the neighbors or open up to the neighbors with one-story parts, one-story pieces. So the building is so really giving back into the fabric of the city that the neighbors came out and supported it and wanted it at any cost, as opposed to somebody who would have slot another monolith between their edge walls. And finally, on the question of TODs, this is something that is very much at the center of our region's growth, the whole of Southern California. This is quarter-mile walking, half-mile bike, and 10-minute drive from stations. Downtown Los Angeles to the right, left Pasadena to the right. You can see how much of this region can be accessed in this extraordinary access by three modes way. And this project in the downtown of Pasadena at this train station is at 100 DUs per acre, which is extravagant density. And of course, under FAR, it was conceived in this way. It's a very dramatic transformation, because we took this, by the way, the low building in the middle is the old train station, 1940. So we took this very rough and very planning heavy project, and we turned it into this by taking basically the entitlement for this project, which was 340 units, and expressing it in four different types. In a tower at the corner, a double lofts, double lofts one on top of the other, industrial lofts, Courtyard Housing to the left, and a 7-story flats building that is buried into the block in the middle. Every one of the four parts of the building has its own courtyard. On the right-hand side, it's on a second level. There is retail around the old station, and this is the project as it exists today. Some of these units, particularly the lofts on the right, the gray building, are so successful, I've never been able to see one, because they're constantly occupied and nobody can ever get in there. The train goes right through the building. This building is really both the vehicular and the train entrance into the downtown of Los Angeles. And it's really a kind of important landmark that has allowed the city to embrace the idea of the trains and this kind of density, which was unheard of before this project happened. The second level that you see has a pool shared by all the units and has all kinds of common space around the pool. Which brings me to Santa Barbara. I'm sorry for rushing, but I really want to have this discussion with you about the future of the city. But I don't think it could be possible without your understanding where we come from as a culture, and where we still unfortunately are through the age of sprawl, and also what kind of progress many of us traditionalists have made through this last 30 years in little by little building projects and generating a world of a kind that is much more accessible, much more desirable, much more positive than the one we've seen before. So Santa Barbara, I don't have to tell you how special it is because you live there, but last night I was going to sleep. I thought to myself, I'm going to come and live in Santa Barbara since I moved to Southern California, but this has not come to pass. Maybe it's time. But secondly, other than Pasadena where I live, over the last 50 years, I must have been in Santa Barbara probably more than 300 times. So the question is, why am I there? Okay, I get it. I have friends. I love the beach. I love State Street. I love some stores. I like the climate. I enjoy the evenings. I love the terrace of the Biltmore. I mean, I can name 30 things. I love the botanical garden. It just goes on and on. But that's not only the reason. That's not the reason that I'm coming over and over and over and over again. I'm coming over and again because it is a city of such remarkable architecture and urbanism that I have constantly felt charged and recharged by coming and observing, as recharged sometimes as going to faraway places in Europe or Asia or South America or anywhere goes to find a world that is so rich in precedent and in presence that one returns a different kind of person. So I want to show you how that has how that kind of physical presence of this wonderful small city has come to mark my understanding, and how also it promises that its future is going to be at least as wonderful as its past, if not better, because certainly better buildings are better than parking lots in my estimation in general terms, and there's still way too many parking lots in downtown Santa Barbara. The one thing that one notices from this image is how magnificent the fabric of the city is, how really extraordinary it is, and how mixed and varied it is, which might be one of the reasons why people love it so much and visit it so much, because it looks unusual and is unusual, because it has old buildings and new buildings in it. It has big buildings and small buildings, and the buildings talk to each other in a way that makes the place familiar to people. These great drawings, which you all know, by Allied Architects, by George Washington Smith, they're not buildings about style. They're buildings about scale. They're buildings about massing. They're buildings about the way you make a city out of an American capitalist system of uneven and diverse investment that generates different kinds of buildings at different kinds of times. But when they all come together, they look like they belong with each other. That's the genius of the place, and it is so rich in transitional relationships. I took all of the pictures that you're going to see from this point on with my camera on my phone on a Saturday morning and a Sunday morning walk of 2 hours each. And the lessons of how buildings relate and to each other, both elevationally and perspectively, is extraordinary. The way in which, you know, the Paseo Nuevo steps down to acknowledge the building next to it on the right, or the way perspectively it relates to the office building to the left, or the way it steps down all the way back to Chapala. This is not a great building, but it's a building of great gestures that over time can also be transformed to be a better object. And on the right hand side is the holy moment in Santa Barbara of the great initial adobes and the way in which they all come together with the Paseo Viejo, how the whole hangs together in that moment is one probably of the most precious pieces of architecture in our country. And the other thing that is remarkable, which also points out the fact that this is not about style alone, is that we really start buildings in design, traditionally start buildings design by choosing types. And we then put these types in context, we contextualize them in order to understand how they relate, what elements they take on, and how these elements are proportioned, and how the scale of the whole place needs to be enlarged or broken down and so on. So when you do that, in the moment then that you come to introduce the stylistic dimension, which is probably both received and personal and imposed, who knows how stylistic impressions begin to be generated and included in buildings. At that point, you're working on a mature body of building that is expressing much, much more than the style it is in. So you can see, for instance, that in these buildings, which probably span about 70 years in terms of the design, really the most amazing thing about them is they're all commercial buildings, and they look like commercial buildings, and they speak to values of access to street and relationship to attracting people, or to attracting workers, or to maintaining workers in place, or to getting light in certain ways, or working in ways that are not residential. And that is actually also a remarkable thing about the city, that its texture and its architectural beginning in a fabric allows it typologically to grow bigger buildings of a different kind that then can all together give the impression of what the city is. And then there is public space. And the city is enormously rich in public space, not only on State Street and what State Street does occasionally, but also in all kinds of other public space, in pocket parks, in beautiful sidewalks, in common places, like the park in the middle, in the middle of your great the name of the building, the courthouse. Sorry, yeah, and on the left, a new public space on top of a building, right? On top of a building. That's the second or third one I've recently seen, and of course, a public space of a kind that is not only whole in terms of the building fabric, but it's whole in terms of the landscape. Notwithstanding the Riviera being poked with houses, you can understand these buildings in place, purely in place, in a way that you could do nowhere else in the city. So how do we proceed and how do we go from here? Has a lot to do with how we understand typology. So one other thing to think about very clearly, and something that's already has been accomplished in Santa Barbara, is this question of typology, but I'd like to give you an idea about how hard fought that has been. This is a 1990 Molen Polyzoides, or the Breville Polyzoides at the time, before my current partnership, a diagram for Playa Vista that explains for the sake of the architects and developers how housing types work. From the words are not very precise. Muse really is not a good word. It refers to a second unit. Shared house is basically a duplex, triplex, or quadruplex. That's clear. A townhouse and a double townhouse, stacked double house. Yes. Courtyard housing, a partial or whole. A villa is really was a type that Leon Krier did in Germany a long time ago, which is basically an elevator driven building up to 4 or 5 stories with corner units. A wall is a perimeter block building, and a tower is a tower. So we understood all of these types. We gave them numbers. We gave them DUs per acre. Everything starts from a single cell of a house to the left. But the most beautiful thing about it is that we began to think about the idea, in 1990, of almost 31 years ago, of how you can combine these types in one lot to give the streets a different definition. How you could put a perimeter block on one street and a house and a row house on the other. How you could do combinations of these types in order to get hybrid types. And then 25 years later, we've clarified this in our new urbanist work by understanding the typological range and the way in which typologies relate. You can see underneath to zones T3, etc., all the way to T6 within an urban fabric. There are ranges and types that are based always on the available size of lots. One of the problems with FAR zoning is it gives the same entitlement to lots by size, and actually the smaller a lot is, the less it should have on it, and the bigger it has, the more it has to have on it. So the proportionality of building to land is absolutely totally destructive in the making of a traditional city. And here you can see all the types arrayed, of course, from low to missing middle to high, and illustrations of all of these as we've discovered them in Southern California. And so the typological game is very much underway in Santa Barbara very clearly. I saw some really extraordinarily beautiful buildings, very inventive, not only stylistically, but also typologically. There is a very much of a deficit in these buildings, which is that they're not organized around very ample public space. The traditional courtyard housing and all the courtyard housing we build, as you can see top right, is really organized from the void to the solid, as opposed to from the solid to the void. So it's not entirely great for developers every single time, but the value of these buildings with people living in them and relating to the extraordinarily quiet and beautiful place in the middle, full of light and full of air and full of greenery, is amazing, because that's a common a place held in common of a kind that doesn't exist, for instance, in the example on the left, which is a very narrow and tall space, probably 4 stories on all sides. The one on the right has 4, 3, and 2-story buildings. But then there is this absolutely remarkable, extraordinary, extravagant way that the Santa Barbara buildings understand themselves as grandchildren of allied architects and George Washington Smith, in taking tall order of facing Chapala, which is a big street, and turning the corner, stepping down, or stepping down on the creek, or understanding the form by stepping down as being composed of house forms, of smaller forms that make them look like much less like inhospitable bars and much more like stacked houses of a kind that one could imagine living in, even on a fourth floor, or particularly in a fourth floor. And then there's the question of mixed use, the same type which on the sides of the buildings could be very broken up and very residential when it's facing streets that deserve or require or demand retail space. Well, the buildings very naturally grow it. And of course, in the light of this architecture, which is very deep and very solid, they're also beautifully expressed, to the point that some of them, I think, are beginning to be the equals of the buildings of the 20s. And of course, it goes on and on. I don't have to tell you very much. I think I'm coming to the very end of my presentation. This sense of urbanity in Santa Barbara is also extended to the streets and to parking. I think it's a very important thing to leave the streets alone. I want you to remember that most European urbanism, for instance, of the cities we admire, was designed and executed before the car. So the streets are there for a reason. I think what has to be limited really is the ownership and the circulation of cars, and the way you regulate cars is not by taking away from people, but by probably taxing them, or by parking them away from units, or parking them at extravagant costs within units or within projects in such a way so that the place becomes more pedestrian, more amply pedestrian. I think the downtown of Santa Barbara could be pedestrian, could be vehicular during the day and pedestrian in the evening. I think the idea of flex streets is an important, fabulous idea that we have to be thinking about. And this is my last architectural slide. The other thing I want to tell you as I was going around is I noticed that there is extraordinary invention, great spirit, great faith, despite many complaints I heard from colleagues, that people are thinking of the idea of architectural expression on top of a stable chassis with such freedom that this architecture goes all the way from normative to extravagant, and it all fits together in the most natural and beautiful ways. So here's the last piece of my presentation. In yellow are parking lots within the historic district. The historic district is almost 50% parking. I haven't done the math, but I don't have to tell you much more about that. The city is so absolutely beautiful in the place that they're built that it's blinded us to the idea that it's terribly ugly and forlorn in the place that there is nothing other than a space for the vehicles that get us there. And so the enormous opportunity, the extraordinary challenge, the once in a lifetime moment is how to take this land and control parking and traffic and build buildings at appropriate scales that maintain the character and the DNA of the city. And so I would say that we've done this only once, but I would suggest that this has to be tried again in Santa Barbara. And that is that in San Antonio, we engaged a half dozen best architects in the city in a charrette to discover what the DNA is and how to infill the city, every single lot in the city, in order to understand what infrastructure would be necessary to sustain it and to write the codes that will allow it to happen. So it is a unique opportunity. There is an extraordinary architectural culture in place in your city, which can actually sustain that kind of dialogue. It has to be a process like this, where working together, we could, for instance, infill every single place as a kind of 50-year exercise, trying to figure out how this works. By buildings of all sizes and all kinds, with a code that does not deliver a crew-cut four-story subject everywhere, but beginning from this idea of a complex massing. Certainly, the preparation of a vision of a specific land talks to neighborhood and district character, to massing, size, capacity, special issues. The public realm talks to street types, open space types, standards, planting palettes, etc., special places. On traffic, street network and sections. I'm going too fast, I'm sorry. On public realm, planting palette in special places, on traffic, street network and street sections, intersection design, ped transit and bike plan, on parking, on-street parking, valet, Uber, loading, transportation, management, etc. On infrastructure, somehow this is going faster than I can control it. Utilities that support development and sustainability strategies, sewer, water, dry utilities, stormwater, etc. Then a code for land use, development standards, setbacks, heights, etc. Parking, design standards for building massing, articulation, frontage, signage, etc. And on specific plan preparation and final arrangements, funding for public improvements, time frame, affordability issues related to the state with incentives, concessions and waivers, which we're fighting everywhere, and then an EIR on streamlined review for individual projects that allow easier developer activity within the downtown area and addressing the impacts of development as much as possible. So apologies for the speed. I've done this in 45 minutes. Despite 140 units, I'm at your disposal, 140, images. I'm at your disposal for discussion. I'm delighted to be with you.
Great. Thank you very much, Stefanos. That was a great, and that even I think that wins for the most slides and it's most great ones. So we might even ask to flip back on some of them as we go forward if we want to pull up
you can have my presentation. I think also if you want to share it, that would be just fine.
Oh, great. Thank you. Wonderful. All right, super. So at this time, thank you very much for the presentation, Stefanos. So now we're going to move to the next step with this symposium. So I wanted to kick us off with a poll question just to get the audience poll. And I see that there's been a good number of questions that have been coming in on the chat box. So we'll try to get through some of those as well as we go forward here. So if you wouldn't mind, Kevin, why don't we kick off with a poll question? Here we go. So this was just to kind of get the juices going, and we'll turn to a discussion after this. But first, from the audience, if you want to answer the question, how should Santa Barbara address state required housing mandates? For those of you who don't know, the state, California has required mandates for how much every town or city should be building for housing. We have to meet those. And basically, if we aren't meeting them, then we also lose control, the control that we have in terms of certain zoning and planning. So that's just sort of quick background for anyone who doesn't know. So here we have our options focused on the downtown, 3 to 4 story buildings in height, spread the density, for those of you who know, downtown to Milpas, with 2 to 3 story buildings. And that would be more in the courtyard housing, show things that you've shown, Stefanos, the smaller courtyard housing, and then densify the single family neighborhoods with bungalow courts. That was sort of the least dense housing you were showing. And then all the above, or the last one is none of the above, don't add housing anywhere, and let Sacramento strip the city of all design control measures. So if you could, click on your choice.
We have about half of the audience has answered, so we'll wait another minute or two.
Sounds good. Great. In the meantime, I'd like to introduce, and if those from the panels can turn on your cameras, the panelists can turn on your cameras, and I'd like to introduce each of you. We have Kristen Snedden. Thank you for joining us. She's, for those of you who don't know Kristen, she's a city council member. Sorry, I'm just also navigating all of my notes here. Okay, so Kristen Snedden is a city council member. She's been very active in a lot of the downtown committees and groups. She's a longtime resident and teaches environmental geology at Santa Barbara City College. She's the chair of the De La Guerra Revitalization Committee, which has been one of the latest efforts for downtown. She's a member of the recent State Street Subcommittee, which was over the last, I think, 6 to 8 months. She's our liaison to the Historic Landmarks Commission. She's proposed the downtown master planning process. She's been a big advocate for it and pushing that throughout in the last number of years. And then as well, I wanted to add that she's been the city council member that's really been strongly involved in this whole discussion for the last probably at least 3 or 4 years. She came to the symposium from 2 years ago and has been actively involved with all the discussions along the way. So thank you, Kristen, and welcome. The next panelist I wanted to introduce was Leo Casas. Leo is the design director for Appleton Associates. They have Santa Barbara office and Santa Monica office, and he is a design director for both. He's there, which is, if you don't know of Appleton Associates, they're an extremely well recognized firm that specializes in high level design, all different project types. Leo has done work in Seaside, Florida. He was actually the town architect there. For those of you who know Seaside as one of the new urbanists, one of the sort of great examples and success stories that has helped really push and launch new urbanism, and won several awards for it, Palladio Award and the Meisner Award for both Seaside and Watercolor, Florida, which are both towns that have very much benefited from new urbanist principles and a lot of the principles that are mentioned here. And Leo has been with us since 2015 out here in California and doing a lot of design work. So we're going to have some design-oriented questions as well for Leo as part of our panel. So thank you very much, Leo, for joining us.
Thank you.
All right. And then Cassandra Ensberg is a architect, FAIA, a fellow, which is a very high honor. Local architect who has been for many years in Santa Barbara working since 1987. She's her and her husband Tom Jacobs are Ensberg Jacobs Design. Cass has been I've grown to know her more and more, especially over the last number of years, as she's been really spearheading a lot of the efforts by the AIA. As the State Street charrette efforts that you've seen from both what was 2017, I think, and then this last year. She's been a very strong advocate, works diligently in the arts community, art advisory, and she's always wanting helping encourage, as an artist herself as well, helping to encourage Santa Barbara to always be thinking with the arts and design, and always there to help out on committees and groups, donating a lot of her time pro bono. And so thank you, Cass, for joining us as well. And so.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you.
All right, so let's kick off here. We've got our results in. We've got 53% saying all of the above, which is, and then followed by 28% saying go sort of medium density, 2 to 3 story buildings between downtown and Milpas, 13% saying only downtown, 3 to 4, and 3% saying bungalow, courts, infills in the single family. And then 2% say none of the above and just want to fight the state. So, all right. Thank you for that, Kevin. Okay, so why don't we do this? We have a couple of questions to kick us off, and then we'll be polling as well from the audience as we go. So let me just pull this up. Okay. All right. So I wanted to kick us off with a question to Kristen. So as a city council member and someone who has been strongly part of this process, including participating in the original 2019 symposium, the recent State Street Subcommittee, and other downtown leadership efforts, what are some of the challenges that our city is facing? And as a follow-up to that question, what did you see from Stefanos's talk that answers or addresses or sort of brings to light some of these issues?
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here tonight. It was that original symposium that I know, Anthony, right afterwards, I immediately came to you and started asking the question of how can we do this for Santa Barbara? I think that the biggest challenge that we've been facing is getting this process going. And I think we're really at this critical moment where we need the process to go well. what we put in place right now, where it's such like a time of rapid change, unlike anything I think we've seen in my lifetime, that this quickly we're making all these changes. And I think we really run the risk of setting sort of pillars in place for the whole downtown that will end up designing around sort of as a byproduct instead of thoughtfully putting those pillars in place. And so some of the things that I'll just mention, we've decided, maybe permanently, maybe not, to make, State Street a promenade. Well, there's already the question of, well, is it really a promenade, or is it now a bicycle and outdoor eating facility and not really room for promenade? So big questions about just even that spine of Santa Barbara itself. And then we have these sort of vacuous spaces, Nordstrom, Macy's, Sears, Uptown. We have a lot that could be set in place for the next 50 years, depending on how we design it or what we allow to be designed there. There's also, we have the De La Guerra Plaza revitalization. We have Library Plaza revitalization. We've talked about closing those cross streets for those projects. How do those tie in with the whole fabric of downtown? And then, of course, housing, our big crisis point issue of housing. So all of those challenges in place, and just hearing this presentation tonight, I'm just renewed enthusiasm that we need to get this process in place and do it right and thoughtfully. And I think, when you talk about open parking lots and those being at play, there are a lot of spaces there that could be housing. There are a lot of spaces in the downtown that could be housing. And I think right now we don't really have a solid vision on how to thoughtfully put that into place. And you mentioned FARs as possibly destroying the fabric. And that's one of our big considerations we're looking at right now, FARs. And I'm not sure that we fully understand the implications of that with the two images you showed of two buildings having the same FAR, but having a different lot size to start with. So we're really at this juncture where so much can go in either direction. And, the bones of Santa Barbara are beautiful, even without the buildings or the architecture. And I think our big challenge is to do no harm, but then also to set in place the future pillars and to do it thoughtfully.
Great, thank you. And actually, as a tie to that, to Stefanos, and because there was a question that came out on from Richard Clausen earlier on, which kind of ties this to the question of FARs that was just mentioned. So can you kind of give a breakdown, because there is discussion, and actually I did a little, with the city urban historian, we did a little study of like what an FAR of a bunch of different historic buildings are, to look at, look, this is the same FAR as what you're getting out of this, but this is a smaller and more compact and historic, and everyone loves it. And so just sort of a study of that. So FARs are a tricky way of measuring something. But Rick Clausen asks, can zoning be established so that the height limit can mitigate extreme building designs based only on FARs? So what are your thoughts on that in terms of only FARs? Is there some way of defining it, or do you need to define forms of buildings? Because a lot of your cube models were showing a shape, right? It was building into a shape, not simply just saying a number. So what would you say?
The question seems very simple, but it's quite complex. I think that there are ways of, there has to be some way, if FAR continues, and sometimes it's necessary for sort of the bean counting dimensions of planning. If FAR continues, it has to be applied differentially to different sizes of lots, because the building that you admire, which is 2.5 FAR, if the same FAR is put in a lot next to it at 2.5 FAR, that's the end of the downtown.
Good point.
That's an important thing to appreciate and understand. So I think there need to be very strong typological regulations that say that in this part of the downtown you can build in certain ways. In other parts of downtown you have to provide 20% of the ground for open space, for a courtyard, for example. So you can relieve the intensity of a development by height, by by setback, by amount of space to be dedicated to open space. I think all of those things can be done. And the other thing that is most important, I think, and you cannot over-regulate this to the degree that you destroy development. That's a whole other subject. And I mean, after all, that's an important dimension of the economy of any city. But the fact is that some very simple rules can have very important results. What you want to avoid is crew-cut buildings. You want to avoid that every building in the city until the end of time, from now on, is going to be 4 stories and nothing else. So you can suggest regulations or standards for relating to the heights of the buildings around certain buildings. You can talk about height averaging. For instance, Pasadena has height averaging, which is if a building is 4 stories, if a building is 3 stories, you can go 1/3 up to 30% 4 stories, but you have then to do 30% 2 stories. So all of a sudden you begin to generate buildings that are broken up in massing, by design. And of course, design review matters and matters tremendously. The situation with the state is thoroughly out of control. We have 2 projects. We're doing a plan for the downtown of Burbank, and we're working with the planning department of Pasadena informally to try to understand what is going on. But basically what they're saying is that form doesn't matter. They're basically saying that your city, forget it. Yeah, you can, just pour it on. That's what they're saying. That you can take the existing condition and add 50% to it. FAR. So then there has to be a very organized process on the part of the planning side of things to begin to negotiate. And one of them, the simplest one, is through concessions, which basically a specific plan would have 35 different standards, but you can only, in order to get more density, you have to choose 3. And which ones do you choose, right? That becomes the question. Maybe height, I don't know. What about parking? And if you know that it's going to be parking and height, then you have to go into incentives or waivers, and you begin to negotiate at another level, so that you end up giving people a faster time for processing against taking on the most promising exceptions from the rules, promising from the point of view of city form, obviously. So it is very complicated and very unpleasant, because the world that we knew as architects and as elected officials and as planners is evaporating before our very eyes. And if there is no legal case against the state, or if there's no way to address this at another scale, it's going to affect California cities in a dire way.
All right. Well, we won't end on that note. We'll keep going. We'll get the right way to do it, and maybe that's something that the city can argue, is that if you had 5,000 units to do, what about showing how this 5,000 units are going to be had, where and in what form, as opposed to allowing everybody to do whatever they want, wherever they want, which is what the state is suggesting. Okay, and I want to get back to that actually with the question for specific plans. But first, I want to jump to Cass and throw a question to you. Over the past 4 or so years, you've helped spearhead the many efforts in the community, especially the American Institute of Architects at Santa Barbara chapter, helped suggest design-based solutions to many of the problems Santa Barbara is facing. So can you describe the charrette purposes and process and some of the ideas that were suggested from the charrette? And then as a follow-up to that, how do some of these ideas relate to the ideas that Stefanos has presented? And so where is there overlap and similarity? And if you want to discuss those.
Thank you. Boy, it's such a big topic and so complicated, as we're seeing. We know it's just really hard to get your head around it all. But first, I'd like to just thank the Trust for putting this series together. It has been incredible. It's been such a great education, and I really appreciated it so much. So I'm honored to be here and be part of this. And I thank all of you for being here. I think Stefanos has explained it all so beautifully well with all of his slides. He's touched on everything, including many images from Santa Barbara. And many of these concepts were what were studied in the charrette. I have here's the charrette booklet.
Mm.
There it is.
It's super thick.
Over 300 pages, and the beautiful image on the front that you all remember. So, you know, we really have been digging into this, and it's our architects and the design community who have the skills to do this. You'll all remember that, you know, in 2017, we did a charrette on this same topic, and then that was in November, and right after that, the Thomas Fire happened, and then we had the mud flow, and so that was the end of that year. And yet we still, you know, struggling with housing and vitality, with the issues relative to, you know, the Amazon effect, as we call it, and the housing issues and environmental issues. So we've been, you know, struggling with this and trying to get our housing that we so desperately need. So in 2019, we did a lot of work to get some of the barriers to housing in the downtown, one of which was the famous donut hole, where we really didn't allow multi-unit housing in the downtown. And in 2020, the early part of 2020, we actually were able to move forward with some of those metrics regarding residential use was now allowed. We did some revisions to the height, the parking, and the open space to make it be what I think a more urban design, more able to do urban design in the classical way. We still are working on this really tricky one, you know, that Stefanos has mentioned, and in detail about, you know, is it FAR? That's kind of the direction we're going, of studying the FAR. And in the charrette, that is what we did. I'll get into this in one second. The charrette 2020 was designed in collaboration with our great friends at the planning department at the city to try to figure out how should we design the charrette to give information that will be helpful to the city in determining what these metrics should be. So that was, we worked with our colleagues there and came up with the charrette. And what we did is we decided that we would have, well, we ended up with 160 architects and designers. So we ended up having 16 teams, 12 of which were allocated to study housing in the form of opportunity sites, you know, parking lots, parking structures, also adaptive reuse from the area from the 400 block to the 1000 block, from Chapala to Anacapa. And then four other teams studied all the public outdoor spaces, the paseos, the parks, the plazas, all of the really important public spaces that go together to make the whole environment work beautifully, and also anticipating more housing. The work was done over July and August with Zoom touch. It was all done virtually with Zoom touch-ins that were open to the public, and the presentations were all open, and we've given presentations to council, and we continue to this day to do that, trying to continue to you know, educate. So we're in the thick of it regarding the FAR, but I am delighted to see the many solutions in here, the financial benefits that Stefanos has mentioned. And clearly we can see the important contributions of our design review boards. And I'm not saying that because of your, Anthony.
Yeah, thanks, Cass.
But you know, clearly you guys have
you very rarely get thanked, so it's okay.
And you know, I feel, although it's such a heavy thing, I mean, Santa Barbara is a magical city, and it is magical because of its traditional urban design. It's a town, it's a real place. You know, people come here and they feel like this is a real village, a real town. It's laid out properly. And
one of the things that seemed also with the AIA charrette, I just seeing this one of the overlays that of the example of oh gosh, it just where you did the Rambla in the middle. Was Lancaster? Stefanos, yeah. I mean, it was interesting to see that, and in similar situations addressing State Street, right? Because we wrestled with that was one of the things that was wrestled with during the charrettes, was what to do with State Street. It was this big long, it's extremely long. It can go on, actually too far if you let it. So at what point do you close things? How much is closed? How does parades happen? All those things seem to be also right. They were also part of the things considered by the charrette and similar kind of thinking.
Right.
And just as a matter of just I'll keep hopping as well, just because I know it is getting late, and we still have a few more questions here. I did want to jump now as sort of a somewhat tie into that in terms of the question of beauty. And so this one's going to you, Leo, and then Stefanos. So as someone who day in day out is involved with beautiful designing beautiful structures and places, how important is beauty and function in the built environment? So what are the other challenges, building codes, et cetera, that are part of requirements that architects, engineers, and everyone have to deal with on a regular basis? And if you can just engineer something, why even waste the time and energy on making something beautiful? I had to just ask, right? And why not just cover the whole thing with solar panels, which can't be no design review. And as a tie to that, what did you see in Stefanos's lecture that was inspiring and that kind of answers some of this?
Well, I've long been an admirer of Stefanos's work, inspiring many of my projects and much of my own design work as well, especially the seminal Courtyards book, because what it really showed us was how to take a resource that was already there, already present. How do you study it? How you understand it in such a way that then you can begin to adapt it, model it, make it place specific, and make it real, right? The sort of DNA analysis that Stefanos showed in going from the bungalow court all the way to the hybrid, that essentially was, that's the transect, as it were, that we as new urbanists use a great deal in showing, what is a place of high intensity or density, and what is one that is less so as you step away from that central point. And one of the other things that to me really strikes a chord is this notion of building from the outside in. Obviously, you care about the project, you care about the program, you care about meeting your clients' needs in terms of penciling out and making the return of investment being, such a thing that he can do the thing. He or she can build the project that you are very carefully composing, but in such a way that you are thinking about beauty, you are thinking about the experience. Santa Barbara can't be as good as it is if it had been thought of as an engineering experiment rather than an artistic pursuit. There was a reason the language was chosen the way that it was, and that it had, and then was promulgated thereafter. It was pleasant. It reminded you of a place that you wanted to be, a place that you wanted to love. And some of us in the new urbanist circles claim this notion or think of this notion as a lovable street. If you can make a street lovable, you're going to walk that street. You're going to walk that street no matter what your destination might be, no matter how struggle-filled that that walk might be, because in those struggles, in those obstacles are probably well-designed places of comfort, places of respite. And you see that on State Street, right? And you see that in some of the paseos that split off of State Street in such a way that I lived in Rome at a time when I taught for the University of Notre Dame's Rome program. And when I come to Santa Barbara, I find myself wanting to get lost in many of the same ways that I loved getting lost on walks in Rome, without a map, without my phone, without any notion of knowing where I was going, but always interested in the journey of it. And so for us, I think as architects, it's not just the end product that we are really most interested in, though business-wise we have to, and for our clients, for ourselves, and our enterprise. But part of the way getting there is understanding in a primordial, very emotional and human way how architecture works with us and how we work with architecture. And when we have that ability to affect it in such a way that you can love it, that you can appreciate it for more than just its substance and more than just its form, that you do it on an ongoing basis where Stefanos says he's been back to Santa Barbara 300 times. If that doesn't say something about the lovability of the place, then I don't know what. And it's its architectural form, right? And that architectural form extends to its urbanism. They work hand in hand. They're part of the same, they're two sides of the same coin. And so going forward, we really do have to take that DNA, splice it and dice it, and apply it in such a way that it is not a one size fits all. It can't be. The FAR and the notions of these regulations, we really have to upend them in such a way that we have to outthink them in such a way that architecture can happen. Because without it, you're not going to have a Santa Barbara that you want or that you like. You're going to have a Santa Barbara that just happened by chance. And nothing worthwhile, especially in architecture, happens by chance. It happens by design, it happens by composition and scale and ornament. All of those things come into play. And the one thing that, in terms of the arc of Stefanos's practice and his work, as closely as I've followed it, is there is always this notion that beauty is overarching, and without it, you don't have the work that he's done and that body, the oeuvre that he's put together and that he's built. And if you haven't been to some of the places that he showed today, you must visit them and see how they work for that place, see what parts of Santa Barbara are working there, and what parts wouldn't work there, because there's so much to learn. One of the reasons I know that Stefanos goes to Santa Barbara is because there's so much to learn. So I'm fortunate each time I get to go from our Santa Monica office to our Santa Barbara office, because I try to find or steal away an hour or two where I can just walk around and get myself lost. It reminds me of Rome. And I think in the truest sense, it reminds me of what cities ought to be.
Great, thanks, Leo. And tying to that, and you can stay. You don't have to go back to Santa Monica.
Trust me, I try.
Tying to that, there's another question about, I think it's a related one, by Christine Piron, who asks, says she's such a big fan, and please talk about grappling with our incredible need for housing and addressing, Stefanos, addressing your deep understanding of livable spaces and construction costs, which seem, that beauty and how to make it work, and yeah, so how to make it pencil, and yeah, go for it.
I mean, it's a very complicated question. I would just simply say that much of it, or most of it, has to do with land speculation, because the price of this construction is not very high. Relatively speaking, it's not very high. It's white plaster and wood frame. I mean, how much less expensive would that be? I think that the problem that we're facing is that a lot of this land is held by private interests, which in this society have the right to put the land in the market for whatever amount of money they please. And therefore, it probably behooves the public sector to use the land that it has for projects, and also to get its hands on more land over time in order to be able to get many of these parking lot projects going. And it probably means maybe some more underground parking. I understand there are water problems in Santa Barbara, but there are issues like that beg the question, or the issue of parking is very complex. I mean, there was a question in the chat about the fact that people need parking. Of course they need parking, But the question is how much? I mean, do you need a parking space for every man, woman, and child in Santa Barbara? That question is very fundamental. And one of the most interesting things about parking is the denser and more walkable cities get. I don't mean denser Manhattan. I'm talking about denser center Santa Barbara. The more you have the city being 2 or 3, instead of being 2 or 3 blocks wide, being 5, 6, and 8 blocks wide at this density, people would walk in it much more comfortably. And the people who are creating the traffic issues in the world, in our world, are the people who live in single-family houses further away, because in order for them to live, they have to travel everywhere by car. An American car in a typical suburban house in Santa Barbara probably moves 25 times a day, coming and going. It's probably, 15 trips, but depending on the number of people, 20 trips, 25 trips a day. And everybody needs to go someplace and park, of course. But I think it's also possible to have a level of intensity in a walkable city that generally tamps down the amount of parking. The park once issue you already have, that is already built in, it's caked into the center of your city. When 25 years ago in urbanists, we began to look at parking, suburban parking is about typically around 4 to 5 per thousand on strips. If you have a strip, I don't know exactly what it is in Santa Barbara, it's something very similar. 4 or 5 cars per 1,000 square feet. In the centers of cities, depending on the intensity, in Santa Barbara level intensity, probably close to 3, 2.5 to 3 per 1,000, which means that it's almost half of what would be in a strip. And the reason is that people, instead of driving from place to place, they end up leaving their car in one place and they start walking, and they don't count as traffic, as trips and or parking spaces. They don't need parking spaces.
So tied to that, there was a question in the chat that's tied to that to Councilwoman Sneddon. So what would be the local political struggle to remake some of the public parking lots into housing if the speaker is correct that we have too much parking? Would reduced parking be an incentive to move away from automobile and towards more sustainable transportation? And I did want to add one little note of additional thought to add to Stefanos's point about the parking. And the question of, well, they're just parking lots. What's so bad about them? And I think there was a couple of years ago, I was doing a tour for Planning Commission and HLC and just talking about the urban form of Santa Barbara. And I intentionally walked them on a certain block in Chapala, so they had to walk along a big parking structure. And I asked them after we walked it, what they felt like, and everyone just kind of put their heads down and walked because they were just getting by that block, as opposed to the other blocks that we were walking and they were looking at and enjoying the architecture, the things to see. And there's just sort of a human element of a parking lot is dead. And so it's not an enjoyable thing to walk along, so you walk past. And even if you plant it with trees or whatever, it's not an active, enjoyable space. So I wanted to kind of toss that on there as well in terms of, so if you want to make a city better, and we already have a really great city and a lot of great buildings, but every parking lot you walk by is a net negative in that urban experience. So if you think of it that way, if we just get rid of the negatives, we're already a better city. We've already made it better than what it was before, as long as we don't screw up the rest of it. So anyways.
Well, I think parking works on the Goldilocks standard, it's not too much or too little, it has to be just right. And the question, I cannot say whether there's too much or too little parking. And in Santa Barbara, I can tell you this, that the more surface parking you have, the more your behavior changes as a driver, and the more of it you demand. And the less there is, the more you end up leaving your car and walking. And in a place like downtown Pasadena, which is not much denser than downtown Santa Barbara, by the way, at its core, there are 4 or 5 parking garages, and the ratio of cars to parking of square feet to parking is I think it's 2.25 per 1,000. So it's a place that in order to go to, you have to leave your car and walk for sure. And at that point, you begin to get into the state of mind that you're not driving from place to place, and you don't need to park outside the business you're going to, and all the kinds of things that suburban driving is all about. But exactly where the city is and what the numbers are and what ought to be done about this is precisely what needs to be studied in a more expansive specific plan.
All right.
And
So Kristen, how's that going to happen?
Okay. So, you know, it's sort of a double edge, these surface parking lots. I mean, in some ways, they're open space. In some ways, that is an opening to the skylight and the mountain views. And so I think this just is more reinforcement for why we need a specific plan. Once we started putting some of these parking lots into play, and all of a sudden we had the Carrillo commuter lot and the Coda lot. And then my question was, well, wait, are all of these parking lots sort of up for grabs and in play, or for what purposes exactly? So if we're relocating farmers market, if we're then at Carrillo putting either tiny homes or dense workforce housing without cars or with cars, or, you know, these are huge questions. And those are really our last negotiating pieces, those surface lots. And, you know, I wouldn't want to give them away. And if they're purposefully planned in a specific plan, and so then we know, well, this is where that type of density is, and this one over here is going to become an open space park, and this one over here is mixed use housing, then we're really talking about something. But this is exactly my fear or concern, that we'll just sort of randomly change the format of some of these surface lots and have missed opportunities to really thought through what we're trading them for.
well,
But
I think,
the will is there.
the most exhilarating and useful and difficult part of urbanism is that it's not a single purpose operation. When we're saying that half of downtown is parking lots, the idea is not that you take that space and you turn it all into housing. You have to have parking. You have to know exactly how much parking you need, and you have to know exactly where it's located and in what kind of built arrangements or surface arrangements. Then you need to think about open space and what kinds of open space: big, small, intermediate, you know, roof gardens, whatever it is that you really want to think about for every one of these layers, 4 or 5 different layers that make up a city. You have to actually have a very clear idea about what these need to be. But they never fit. They never fit unless you put them one on top of the other and you begin to resolve the relationship with each other, right? In the end, if you think that if you fill it, you get 5,000 units of housing, by the time you take it down to everything else, you now have 3,800, because you've done all kinds of other things with the remainder of the space. So, I mean, ultimately, urban design is about the reconciliation of those conflicts, and the complete negation of single-purpose thinking. Parking should be parking. Parking should be all open space. Parking should be all building.
You make a really great point there, Stefanos. You know, it almost begs the question: why not take a few of these, you know, very tactically important empty lots or parking lots, and do something with them, and find somebody that is willing to take on that experiment. Think about the typological complexity that would work best in each of those different locations. And essentially, you've got model projects. You've got you know, places where you can test some of these thoughts and ideas that are Santa Barbara specific, but based on really good traditional urbanism DNA, and all of the most recent 30 years of new urbanism that we've learned along the way that do work, that may call into question some of the regulations that are one size fits all, that maybe work in Pasadena but don't work in Santa Barbara, or vice versa. And think about it as a way of kicking it off with some seed money. There have to be investors out there just waiting to do something good, something right. You know, we bought the office in Santa Barbara, bought some old buildings, and we converted that into our office most recently. Not because we wanted to make a case study in adaptive reuse, but more so because we loved the buildings, we loved the space they created, we loved the creativity that we thought it could foster in our enterprise. And there have to be others willing to invest in Santa Barbara, where maybe there's a way of expediting that, maybe facilitating that in such a way that it becomes a normative thing, rather than the exception.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Cass, did you want to throw in any more 2 cents before we close it out here? Any final thoughts as well on the presentation or anything else?
I would just like to say that I am so proud of this profession of architecture and design and the work that we do and how passionate we are, and that, you know, it's the architects who are responsible for this beautiful city that we have, that have, you know, largely,
we'll throw them a bone.
yes, landscape, yeah, I mean those also, but you know, it is that work that's done, and so I feel confident. I feel confident in the architects and the designers that they will do really great work. So that gives me hope, and I so appreciate this this discussion that we've had. So, and it's just been, you know, really informative, and I'm so glad that there's so many here to hear all of this.
Great. Well, thank you. So thank you very much, Stefanos. It has really been a great pleasure, and it was a wonderful presentation, and I think everyone has learned a lot, and it's great to see both your thinking and you being such a huge figure in this whole movement over the last 30+ years, and to hear from you, your experiences, and also see some of your projects that you've done that have been so successful. So thank you very much for coming to Santa Barbara and then going back and then coming in the Zoom meeting.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to seeing you all next time I come, which should be very soon.
Yes.
The 301st, maybe.
Let us know when you're here. Maybe we can do a walkabout.
That'd be wonderful. I will definitely do that.
That would be fun.
And
Sounds
Anthony, could I add, we just today opened the application pool for members who'd like to serve on the State Street Master Planning Committee, and we really are looking for a broad cross-section of people who love Santa Barbara and have wanting to contribute to that master planning. So really, it's an open invitation to please apply.
Absolutely. Good point.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you. And also, I want to just give one last thanks and shout out to all of our sponsors, and thank you so much for continuing to support this this symposium and this project. And yeah, we look forward to seeing everyone next time, and then hopefully the time after as well. All right.
See you all soon. Take care. Bye.
Adios. Good night.
Thank you.